So thank you very much, all of you, for joining. And we're going to now start with the talk on the Passion Week. We've done the week, the 4 days, the inspection of the Lamb up to the Last Supper. We did the Passover Seder last night, and we're doing the trial and the crucifixion today. And then on Sunday at 5 o'clock, I will do the first fruits and the resurrection. So we're doing Jesus' trial and crucifixion. And just to give you the perspective on it, I think that he was crucified on the Thursday, although there's some controversy about it, whether it was the Wednesday, because it says you must have your Passover on the 14th, the Erev, the evening of the 14th. But some folks say, no, he had an Essene Passover, which would have been on the day before, would have been the Tuesday evening, and then being crucified on the Wednesday. But I'm just taking it that it's Thursday, and that the inspection of the lambs happened from the Sunday through to the Wednesday, this area here, and that he was in the grave for 3 days and 3 nights. Because remember, on the biblical calendar, it's from evening to morning. So you've got evening to morning 1 day, that's Thursday to Friday. Evening to morning 1 day, Friday to Saturday. Evening to morning 1 day, Saturday to Sunday. So that's why I'm doing it that way at the moment. And it was that way. They had the Passover on the 14th. Whether it was a Wednesday or Thursday, I don't know. But no, they always had the Passover on the 14th until Constantine in 325 CE, because Constantine and the Gentile bishops all wanted to disassociate themselves from their Jewish roots. And as I think I said to some of you, I don't think Ingrid was with us, so I'm just going to repeat that. They were called 14thers because they celebrated the Passover on the 14th and not on the Friday, the Good Friday. These people who are crazy like us, you know. So there we go. Then we know that that Jesus went up to the Mount of Olives. They sang a song after their Passover, and the disciples all fell asleep while Jesus was praying. And then when it was really dark, they heard the trampling of the soldiers' feet, and Judas betrays Jesus with a kiss, and the temple guards arrest him late that night. And then they take him to Annas, who was the previous high priest, still late at night. Then they take him to his son-in-law, Caiaphas, who was the current high priest. And this is significant because he was to be the once and all for all sacrifice. And the Torah stipulates that the atonement sacrifices need to be done by the high priest. So that I thought was quite interesting. And then he was taken still during the night to Herod, where Herod was demanding some kind of miracle out of Jesus, and his soldiers were all mocking him. So that was a really unpleasant experience. And then I just want to say that Jesus did not appear before the Sanhedrin for a trial, which was the official thing by law that the Jewish people had agreed. That was the way Torah worked. And for 2 reasons. One, they did not meet at night. And secondly, they wouldn't have met on a holy day like Passover. And so it's not correct to blame the Pharisees for the crucifixion of Jesus, or all Jews, because remember, most of his followers were Jewish. And the other thing is that we know that certain of the Pharisees stood up for him and said, we can't let this thing happen, it's not right. So, okay, so then early the next morning, they take Jesus for Pilate, the Roman governor. And as you can see, what I'm doing is I'm just going through so that we can, as the Bible often talks about, remember the Sabbath, remember the feast days, remember this and the other thing. That's why I'm taking us through. We're remembering these things. And then the Pilate, after questioning Jesus, found him innocent of all the crimes that they were accusing him of. And as you know, Pilate washed his hands of the whole matter because he feared a riot, it says, from the crowd, which appeared to have been hired by the Sadducees. Remember, the Sadducees ran the temple, and they thought Jesus was saying, destroy this house, this temple, the Habayit, and in 3 days I'll rebuild it. So they were fearing he was going to destroy the temple. So they were very keen to get rid of him. But I think that I have a suspicion that Pilate was washing his hands because he was mocking the Sadducees, who had a very strong tradition of washing their hands. And as you know, Jesus had arguments with them about it as well. Yeah, so there we go. And then he goes before Pilate, and they had this issue about whether you could set a prisoner free on a holy day. On any one of the holy days, they could set, it was a custom, and they were going to set somebody free on that day. And, well, Pilate was going to, and I think he was hoping that the people would shout out for Jesus. But the chief priests and the elders, now remember the chief priests are the Sadducees. The elders probably would have been Pharisees, which is quite an interesting thing, persuaded the multitude that they should ask for Barabbas and destroy Jesus. The governor answered and said to them, which of the two should I release to you? And they shouted Barabbas. And Pilate said to them, what shall I do then with Jesus, which is called the Messiah? And they all shouted or said to him, let him be crucified. So it's quite interesting, this whole thing. As you know, they shouted for Barabbas, Bar-Abbas. Now, Jesus was son of the Father, you know, the God, our Father. But Bar-Abbas also means son of the Father. That's quite interesting, because remember, for the Yom Kippur sacrifice, they had two identical goats. So here you have two identical goats, and then they drew lots for which one was going to be sacrificed and which one was going to be the scapegoat. So it's almost like a picture play on this whole thing happening here. Whether it is or not, I don't know, but there's another place where it ties in with Yom Kippur, so let's see what you think about that. Then, as you know, Pilate then had Jesus whipped, and when he was almost dead, they stopped at 49 lashes, which was horrific. He had to carry the cross, and because he was so ripped up and so on, they got Shimon or Simon of Cyrene to help carry that cross all the way up to the hill in Golgotha, and it must have been a horrendous thing. And then what's also quite interesting is that the lambs were slaughtered in the temple from 9 a.m. to 3 p.m. That took 6 hours to slaughter about 3,000 lambs. You can see the whole process there in that picture. Now, Jesus was on the cross for 6 hours, from 9 a.m. to 3 p.m. And what's also interesting is the place where the red heifer bull was offered on the Day of Atonement, which is Yom Kippur, was outside the camp or outside the city. And that also ties together with the atonement sacrifice. And Jesus' sacrifice wasn't an annual one, but once and for all, outside the city. So some think it was the same place, outside the city. There we have where the red heifer bull was sacrificed outside the city. And there we have Jesus being sacrificed outside the city. And it went dark from 12 to 3 p.m. And it says that in Psalm 22, so we know this Psalm, where it talks about, it's prophesying almost this whole thing that Jesus is going through. For dogs have compassed me, the assembly of the wicked have enclosed me, they pierced my hands and feet. We know that happened to Jesus. I may tell my bones, I may count my bones. I suppose if he's with his arms outstretched like that and looking down, his rib cage would have been pushed out and he would have been able to see all his bones. The other thing it means, of course, is that his bones weren't broken when they came to see if he was dead. They reckoned he was dead already, so they didn't break his bone, and then they stuck a spear in his side, and water and blood flowed out. And as you know, the medical professions say that that's a sign that a person is definitely dead. And then, of course, there they're casting lots for the garments. So this is an amazing prophecy that David, who's actually Yeshua being the son of David, that David made this prophecy. I think it was David. And isn't it amazingly accurate of how this all happened? And then what's quite interesting is all four Gospels say that a sign was put out on Jesus' cross, and most of the pictures put it up in Latin as INRI, which is an abbreviation for Ius Nazarenus Rex Judaearum, or something like that, Rex Judaearum, or something, which means in English, Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. But interestingly enough, John in chapter 19, verse 20, specifically says that the sign was in Hebrew and Greek and in Latin. So if we have a look at what it says in Hebrew, it says Yeshua ha-Notzri umelech hayudim. And I've highlighted the first letters, and that, as you know, means Jesus the Nazarene, not of Nazareth, Jesus the Nazarene and the King of the Jews. And if you write it that way, it puts the name of the holy name of God there as Yud He Vav He, which I thought was very interesting. And then you know that Joseph of Arimathea, who was a Sadducee, and Nicodemus, who was a Pharisee, took care of Jesus' burial. They were both rich, as the prophecy states. And it says in Isaiah, you know this as well, he was taken from prison and from judgment. And who shall declare his generation? For he was cut off out of the land of the living. For the transgression of my people was he stricken. And he made his grave with the wicked and with the rich in his death, because he had done no violence. Neither was there deceit in his mouth, or neither deceit in his mouth. So we look at this whole passage and we say, wow, you know, how did God, way before all these things happen, describe them in such detail and such accuracy? Anyway, the issue about this here is, first of all, I think they were taking down Jesus from the cross too late, because it was before sunset, so this is too dark, although it still might have been the darkness from midday, of course. Also, they were in kaput again, which only came in the 1900s. And I think the other interesting thing is that it must have been very difficult for the rulers to say that his disciples had stolen his body, because here we have a Sadducee and a Pharisee, both in senior positions, who could have denied the fact that his disciples stole the body. So now what I'd like to do, because, you know, I think everybody's seen the movies and the crucifixion and all the horrific scenes, rather than sort of focus on that, I thought, let's talk about this dreadful day. It was a dreadful day. And that was for Jesus and for our Father. But for us, it was a wonderful day, because Jesus paid the price for our sin, something nobody else could do and nobody could do for themselves. So only he was righteous enough to pay the price for our sin. And as we have seen, there had to be a blood sacrifice of an innocent lamb to pay this price for us. And, you know, we had John the Baptist declaring Jesus as the Lamb of God. Paul says the Passover lamb, and it's applicable to any of us who trusted as his sacrifice to atone for their sin or our sin. So rather than talk about some of the gory stuff, I want to talk about the background to this momentum event. The background is actually all tied in with the 7 feasts of the Lord. So I'm going to rather talk about those things, because it's God's plan for mankind, and the Father has shown us this plan through the festivals of exactly what would happen through the 7 feasts of the Lord. And note, we often say, oh, surely they're the Jewish feasts, but most of you folk will know they're not. They're the feasts of the Lord, because this is what it says in Leviticus. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, speak to the children of Israel and say to them, the feasts of the Lord, which you shall proclaim to be holy convocations, they are my feasts. So as Christians, we shouldn't just say, you know, these are for the feasts of the Jews. The first thing, it's God's feasts. Secondly, the Christian faith, grew out of Judaism. The early followers of Jesus were all Jewish, and the earliest Gentile followers were around 15 years later, after Jesus' crucifixion, which would have been the time of Cornelius, and slowly but surely more and more Gentiles came in. And I'm not going to talk about that now, because I cover it in my talk on the parting of the ways between Jews and Christians. So there we go. So that's what we see here. Now the issue is the feast of the Lord, my feast. So note twice, they are feasts of the Lord. He's serious about this. And then, what does this mean? What is a feast and what is a convocation? Well, a feast, if you look at the Hebrew, it's moedim, which means appointed times or set time. It's like a time that God sets in his diary. And maybe we should too, because they are his feasts and he wants to meet with us and have fellowship with us at these times. So that's the one issue. The other one is convocations, this funny word. The Hebrew word is mikra, which means a rehearsal. Rehearsal for what? Well, for what God's plan is, for what he's going to do at special times. And it can also mean a gathering. And so one could gather to rehearse at appointed times for the set times when God is going to do his thing for mankind. So there we go. Now let's have a quick look at them. What were they? Well, as you know, we celebrated Passover last night, which is when they put the blood on the lintels of the doorposts. And then the lamb, the angel of God, the angel of death came over them and they passed over, and then none of the first would die. So we know about that. And then the crucifixion happened on the 14th of the first month, exactly the same day and the same time that the lambs were being slaughtered in the temple. So there we go. So they were told to keep this feast, and one wonders why. They kept it for 1,200 years, and then Jesus came, and he was crucified to be the Lamb of God. So the feasts actually foretold this event in great detail, as you would have seen also in the Passover Seder last night. And then we have the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which happened on the 15th, in the evening, the night of the 15th, after the Passover lambs were killed. They had to have unleavened bread because they were told to do this to remember when you left Egypt, you had to have bread with no leaven because the bread would go bad if it had leaven in it, and they had to live on this leaven for 7 days until they were fed with manna in the wilderness. And that's why they celebrated it for 7 days. And as you know, leaven is a metaphor for sin. So Jesus was in the grave sinless, without sin, 3 days. I won't go into details about this. Why 3 days and not 7? I don't understand that. And then we come to the Feast of First Fruits. And that is on the day after the Sabbath, after the Passover. So you have the Passover and then the Sabbath. And whatever the day, the next day, the first day of the week after the Sabbath, that was, they would celebrate the first fruits. So in this case, it was on the third day after the Passover, obviously the next day after the Sabbath, and they offered the first fruits of their barley harvest. And that's when Jesus rose from the grave, the resurrection. So again, we see this happening in great detail. And on Sunday, I'm going to cover the first fruits and the resurrection in much more detail. I'm going to talk about this whole bit in much more detail. So there we go. So I won't talk about that now. And then I just want to include one more, because it's not part of the Passion Week, but this Shavuot is a very important one as part of the spring feasts. It was 50 days after Shavuot that the Torah was given at Sinai. The event had fire above the people's heads and above the mountain, and they heard voices. Now, call was translated as thunders in English, but call usually means voice in Hebrew. And they were told to remember it and to count 50 days. And it's the only feast where no date is given specifically, where they're just told to count 50 days. And it's like what they did, some of the tradition was they'd take barley that they'd harvested, and they'd use one barley grain a day as a counter, and they'd sort of put it somewhere that they could see how many, and it built up anticipation as the days were counted up to something very special. And where am I? Here. And then we know that Jesus said to his disciples, stay in Jerusalem until Pentecost, because the promise of the Father is going to come. And we see that what happened in Acts chapter 2, Jesus told his disciples to wait for the promise. The Holy Spirit was poured out in the form of tongues of fire. See the similarity? And they spoke in unlearned languages, call, voices. And it's quite amazing that the people who were at the feast from all the different nations who spoke different languages, heard them speaking the wonderful things, probably praise that they were saying. They heard it in their own language. And of course, we know that the Torah was written on the hearts of the believers at that time, because it says, the covenant I will write on their hearts. So that very similar event, these two events are very similar. The one in the Pentecost was very similar to what happened at Sinai. So what is the point that I want to make? The point I want to make is that each of the spring feasts, here they are, were fulfilled by Jesus on the same day as the feast day. And in some cases, with the crucifixion, at exactly the same hour. So you can see that the Lord has linked these feasts to his prophetic calendar. They sort of almost form his prophetic calendar. Remember, it's Moedim, appointed times, calendar events. God has put them down. They're going to happen whether we like it or not in the time that he has decided. So if these 4 feasts were all fulfilled on the same day, in other words, those feasts were fulfilled by Jesus on the same day as those feasts that the Jewish people had been keeping for 2,000 years, do you think it's likely that the autumn feasts will be fulfilled in the same way? Can I hear something there?
Yeah.
Yeah, you think so? Okay, great. I don't know whose voice that was, but thanks very much. And then the autumn feasts are just as exciting, as they speak of the time to come. Here are the autumn feasts that have been kept by the Jewish people now for 5,780 years. No, yes, on and off. And they speak of specific things which I'm not going to deal with now, but I will talk about them on Sunday when I deal with the first fruits. So that was the chat for tonight. I just want us to sing a song quickly. Let's just sing. I think you all know, Turn Your Eyes Upon Jesus. And then we can have a few questions. Turn your eyes upon Jesus. Look full in his wonderful face, and the things of earth will grow strangely dim in the light of his glory and grace. Parrot, sing it for us.
Yeah, I was waiting for her. She's listening. She's gonna learn.